Well, welcome to the unit on the respiratory system. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to identify all of the structures in the respiratory system, or at least the primary structures in the respiratory system. In other words, if you had a diagram, you could sit down and look at it and name what these structures were when you looked at it. So let's get started. We're going to start at the top and work our way down. So we're going to start with the structures that are in the upper respiratory system. And we're talking basically those that are in the head here. So let's start with the nasal cavity. Okay, the nasal cavity right here makes sense. It's where your nose is, and naso refers to nasal or nose. Okay, and the purpose of your nasal cavity is number one, to bring air in from the outside, but it has several other functions too. Say, for example, it warms the air so that you're not getting cold air down in your lungs. It adds moisture to the air so the air is not dry and drying your structures out in the respiratory system. And it has small little hairs in it. And those little hairs serve the purpose of collecting dust, microorganisms, bacteria, etc., so that you don't get them down into your body. In other words, it traps it. So the nasal hairs and the mucus will trap those foreign particles that we don't want in our lungs. So the nasal cavity warms the air, helps filter the air, and it moistens the air before it goes down into the respiratory system. The second part of the respiratory system located up here are your sinuses. And these are actually two sinuses right here. And sinuses are basically holes or cavities. And again, it serves that function of helping to warm and moisten air. And this also gives them a quality to our voice. The resonance of the air going around in there when we talk helps give our voice quality. You would notice that if you ever had a sinus infection or stuff up nose and people say, oh, they're talking so nasal because you start to talk like this because the air is not resonating around in those cavities. The medical term for sinus is sinus, and with a combining form, it's sinuso. Okay, so let's move further down in the upper respiratory system, and we're going to start looking at the mouth to throat area. So we'll start off with the pharynx. Pharynx, spelled P-H-A-R-Y-N-X. Some people misspell this a lot, and they flip the Y in the end and put pharynx, but it's not, it's pharynx. So the pharynx is, in other words, is your throat. And it's this area located back behind your mouth right here. So that's your pharynx. Pharyngo is the combining term for pharynx, or as you would call it, your throat. The second structure we're going to talk about is the larynx. And again, L-A-R-Y-N-X, larynx. And your larynx is, in other words, your voice box. This is where the sound comes from by those cords opening and closing and making vibrations. Laryngo is the term for larynx, which means your voice box. And the last part in the upper respiratory system is the trachea. And the section below the larynx here on down is your trachea, surrounded by cartilage rings. And the term in medicine for trachea, tracheo, trache or tracheo. The common term for this would probably be your windpipe. So pharynx is your throat, larynx is your voice box, and trachea is your windpipe. So with that, we've covered the upper respiratory system. Now let's take a look at the lower respiratory system. So these are the things below the trachea. So when you breathe air in, if we start up here, it went through your nasal cavity, down through your pharynx, down through your larynx, and into your trachea. Now we're going to talk about where does it go from there. Well, the next thing it would do is it would go off and it would divide off into one of these two structures, which are your bronchi. Bronchi. One of them is a bronchus. It's Latin. More than one is a bronchi. The term bronchio. So the large structures, the first divisions coming off the trachea are the bronchi. From the bronchi, it'll travel into smaller structures, small bronchi, and just like in the cardiovascular system, where we had arteries went into small arterioles, bronchi go into small bronchioles. So small bronchi are bronchioles. From here, the air is going to travel into the alveoli. At the very end of each of these structures, there are these grape-like pouches, and they are called alveoli. If you come up to the top of the picture here, you're going to see this is a very large, blown-up version. So this would be the bronchiole, where the air came down into it, and these are all the alveoli. So they look like, again, grape structures, although you'd look at these microscopically to see them this big. And this is where that oxygen goes into the blood, because there's all covered with capillaries here. And then the waste can come out of the blood and back into the alveoli. That all happens right here. So the alveoli are those small grape-like structures at the end of the bronchioles where respiration actually takes place. Two other items we need to talk about when we're talking about the respiratory system. Of course, we have the lungs. And the lungs, you have two, a right and a left. And the right and the left lungs have lobes in them. The left lung has 2 lobes, the right lung has 3 lobes. We think that's because the heart kind of takes up the space of a lobe on the left side. Terms that mean lungs in medical terminology: pneumo, and pneumono all mean lung. Pulm and pulmono all mean lung. So we have 5 different terms there to learn that all mean the same thing, and they all refer to the lungs. And then the last structure that we want to talk about is the pleura. Now, the pleura in this picture would be the dark red right on the very outside edge of these lungs. And the pleura is the membrane that surrounds the outside of the lungs, protects it, it keeps it moist so that friction doesn't build up when the lungs expand and contract. The medical term for pleura is pleur or pleuro with its combining form. So just as a review of some of the words or the combining forms that we talked about when we're talking about structures of the lungs, do you remember what each of these means? Laryngo, larynx, tracheo, trachea, naso, nose, pneumo, lungs, sinuso, sinuses. Oh, here's naso again. Apparently I have that on here twice. Nose, pleuro, the membrane surrounding the lungs called the pleura, and pulmono, the lungs. Okay, so with that, we've covered the main structures of the respiratory system. It would be a good idea if you completed the labeling exercises on page 228 and 229 in your textbook to help you remember the terms. In addition, I have a diagram posted in Canvas that if you have the ability to print, you could print, or even better yet, put your artistic skills together and draw yourself a diagram of the respiratory system and label the parts. That will be the most helpful in helping you remember the names of the parts of the respiratory system.